see the opening ceremony for the Tokyo Olympics 2021?
Oh, of course. Yeah, I did.
Yeah, and you know my favorite thing about it? They use a lot of video game music while the Parade of Nations.
Yeah.
And
even ones that are niche that I didn't think would be popular.
Right?
Show.
They use Kingdom Hearts and Legend of Zelda and...
Yeah, games that I personally grew up with and are not represented in the mainstream. And so of all soundtracks, it's these video game soundtracks.
Yeah, so Japan wanted to sort of get that feeling of champions or that feeling of sort of this epic moment for a lot of the Olympians. So that's why they wanted to use those music, because obviously that's so fitting for the Tokyo Olympics.
And it just so happens that the symbol of the Tokyo Olympics was a leaf. And we just so happen to be here at the Botanical Gardens. So the theme and topic of what our dialogue would be centered around is like the leaf and plants and flowers, basically botany. And when we think of art, we often think of like people and portraits, but we forget that even plant life has inspired so many writers and artists throughout the ages. So I think it's very appropriate and to address this sort of thing in regards to art.
As an artist, how would you describe where you get your inspiration from? Is it like from nature? Are you inspired by plants at all?
Well, that's a good question. Up until college, when I studied art history, I quickly learned how often in the West, we often disregard the airplane because it's making too much damn noise. So we often disregard nature in education and regarding art education. In university, I quickly learned that in Eastern art history, it's quite different. Man and nature are one, and so you often will see a lot of nature scenes. There's also the classic American landscapes in the American West.
The Manifest Destiny,
yeah.
Am I right?
Exactly. But I mean, it's just like nothing political. It's just landscapes became a thing. But besides that, there's really nothing in Western art that alludes to nature as a whole. But in the East, especially in Japanese art, you would often find a lot of landscapes. And whenever there's people in it, they are one with nature. They're not the center of the piece. So for example, there'll be like a 50,000 foot Mount Fuji and there's tiny people somewhere in the corner and you will hardly notice them. And it's meant to be that way. They're not the center of attention. And so that really opened my mind into how I look nature and how nature can inspire us, not just people.
Speaking of inspiration, if you ever come across the Olympics YouTube channel, they actually did a very short film, animated film produced by Studio Ponak. If you're not familiar with that studio, it's basically animators who came from Studio Ghibli, so you might already know where that's
familiar with the style.
Yeah, and that was a really cool animation to watch because they featured a lot of the 5 elements of nature, not just earth, but fire, water, air, and you can really tell this is very East Asian type theme, so it makes sense. It really makes a lot of sense.
I mean, yeah, historically, even within that animation, aside from the fact that they did a great job without any dialogue and just really telling exactly what the plot is for that short. And of course, if you're familiar with a lot of Miyazaki films and just Japanese society in general, you'll notice that there are references alluding to climate change, you know, the environment, all centered around this animated ad for the Olympics. Really great job. The symbol is the leaf, and so, yeah.
When you actually look at a leaf, do you ever notice how you see all the little vines, all the little details?
The veins.
The veins, not vines, my bad. The veins. And then, for example, look at the ground. You can even see different types of grass and the little leaves that grow between, and it makes this whole bunch of like...
Oh, it's quite a good topic actually. Even the plane is excited. So regarding grass, there's this idea in the humanities. There's a term known as rhizomatic. So rhizomes, you know, being spreading, and that's how grass is. Moss, all those kinds of plants. Trees, however, are arboreal, so there's like a hierarchy. It's going up and down. Rhizomatic is more democratic. It spreads. It's redistribution. So a lot of philosophers and writers get their inspiration from plants, and that's how they got the idea of a rhizomatic system versus an arboreal system. So like think Arbor Day. That's where the word arbor came from. Arboreal, like a tree.
Arboretum. do you think of painting portraits of people versus painting a portrait of a plant or a flower?
Well, I think people underestimate the beauty in botany or plant life. And for centuries, a lot of artists and writers have actually been inspired by plant life. In fact, the German philosopher and writer Johann Wolfgang Goethe actually wrote about, in his essay, the metamorphosis of plants. And he was the first to suggest that perhaps plants evolve and develop the way humans do. Now, a lot of his stuff were proven right, while some were proven wrong, but he was the first to inspire the study of botany, the study of understanding and studying plant life. And this idea started to permeate all throughout German society and history. Like the other German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche has a quote, and he once stated that we often look to the beauty of plants that we forget its roots. And that's how we got the idea of the notion of returning to your roots, returning to where you came from, where you worked hard, and what gave you success all throughout your life. And Goethe was also the first to invent this idea of storytelling called Bildungsroman, and in the loose translation is coming of age. So you're familiar with the coming of age story, where it centers around a character and they learn and develop. Now, the difference between Bildungsroman and today's movies is that we as Americans love closure, we love an ending. Like once you reach the peak, that's it. Everything is over. For Goethe, he says that learning is continuous. So a lot of his plays and stories don't really have a final ending. It just kind of stops abruptly, but it suggests that there's more to learn. As an American viewer, you would read his play and you would think, okay, well, what happened? Like, where's the ending? But that's the point, there's no ending. So it's interesting how his ideas of storytelling can be closely associated with the way in which he studied plants. And he drew a lot of inspiration from plants. The fact that there's a metamorphosis, there is an evolution, there's change. You're always growing. You know, nothing is really stopping you. There are a lot of things are dictated by choices, more or less. So that's what I find interesting about plants and what we take for granted. And then, of course, that idea has inspired many other artists and writers throughout history. That's what I like about plants.
Yeah, to me, I don't really pay attention to specific plants or anything like that. Whenever I look at paintings and sometimes even portraits, the first thing I try to notice more is the background. Like, what decisions does an artist make when they are putting a figure in a space? And sometimes nature is just something that appeals to a lot of people, and I think that can make those paintings much more appealing than just being in a room. For me, I particularly like depictions of nature, but the thing about nature is you don't have to notice it right away. It's something that happens that you don't even notice. Sometimes to me, I think that's what artists, when you look at a painting, it does its job if you don't notice all the details. I think the most interesting depiction of nature I've seen so far is in Japanese woodblock prints. It's an interpretation of nature. It's not even like super realism of plants or anything like that. I want to mention I really love background art in animation, and particularly ones made for Studio Ghibli films. They have like a background artist for those, and the beauty in that is that you shouldn't notice the background. It's supposed to blend in to make you immerse in the world that it exists, just like you existing in this world. You don't just be like, oh my god, tree, but it's like, oh, we're in this space. Yeah, one of my favorite background artists, Katsuo Oga, he's known to do a lot of background art for Miyazaki films. The way they depict nature is not based on realism at all. It's based in this almost fantasy world of realism, if that makes sense.
Magic realism.
Yeah, that's like my favorite theme in a lot of art.
So here we are, just dropped by the airplane.
One more time.
Parachute. Okay. Plants are underrepresented, and I think it's not fair that they're not included in the conversation regarding arts and representation. Well,
You should do your documentary voice.
this is known as the Mini Rhine River, cousin of the Rhine River in France. I don't know.